My name is Emmanuel PASTREICH. I'm the director of the Asia Institute, and we're going to have a seminar this afternoon on the topic of the future of East Asia. We have with us today the founder of the Emerging Future Institute, that is Benjamin J. Butler, who is visiting us here in Korea, and of course, Emerging Future Institute is a co-sponsor for today's seminar.
That's okay, it's fine.
We also have with us Dr. Let's start over again. Dr. Philip Frances, who is a professor at Schumacher University in England, and who is an expert in holistic science. Welcome. And we also have a group of very distinguished and thoughtful individuals with us today, so maybe we'll just take a second first to ask each person to introduce himself or herself. Dr. Hosaka, I can pass this around.
Yeah, let's just pass it around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. My name is Yuji Hosaka. I'm Japanese Korean. I came here in 1988. And so I naturalized as a Korean in 2003. And I am a professor of Sejong University, and my major is politics. And so I'm teaching to students about Korean politics and the relationship between Japan and Korea, and especially the doctor issue of Korea and Japan. And so I came here because I received the email from this institute, and so I came here to learn many things from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
You can just say on. You don't have to speak. I know the students are looking rather nervous now. You can just say your name and what you're studying or what your job is.
My name is Emmanuel. My real name is Untitled, and I prepare to become a PhD student before I will start early next year.
Excellent.
Hi everyone, my name is Jose, and I study world politics at Leiden University College in the Netherlands. And I am doing an internship at the Asia Institute, so I'll be here over the summer. And I came here because I'm really interested in East Asian politics and also Chinese politics in particular. Thank you.
Hi, my name is CHUNG-ANG, and I'm currently studying in the second grade at Daewon Foreign Language High School. And I'm majoring in Spanish in high school right now. I came here because I'm pretty interested in East Asia relationships, and I'd like to learn more from experts here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Andrew Zhang. I'm the business owner of education, the learn together. And my first major was forest resources and ecosystem engineering, something Korea University. And the second one is computer science. And the third is law. And I'm very like to study law. Here, I got some email, thank you, the institute. I read a book of EMANUEL, and I really like it. Yes, I want to learn about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Vinka Jain, and I'm here thanks to the invitation Benjamin issued to Philip and myself to come to this event in Korea. I run an NGO in England, and one of our main projects is working with water, regenerating landscapes wherever there is a drought
sure I'm busy simply because I support as board chair of Asia Institute, Professor Emmanuel, like today.
Thank you. My name is Akhil Singh. I'm a history professor at Gangnam University. I also support my dear professor friend. Okay.
Hello, my name is Akhil Singh. I follow my dad, and I'm 11 years old at Korean age. I'm interested in computer science and history and nature protection. Currently, I get an article about nature protection. It's about the water issue of the Korea. If you see my article, I gave the idea about the river, that instead of destroying the dam, we can connect the river, and then we don't need to break the dam, and the water can go through in, so the fish can live. Thank you.
Right. Got my own microphone then. David Mason. Currently, I've got my own right here.
I think they
for
need
the recording purposes. David Mason of CHUNG-ANG University, mostly in culture and tourism, 33 years in Korea. Have always been interested in future of East Asia because I've made my life over here. I am officially serving as moderator of this discussion, try to just keep things moving properly on schedule and stop any fistfights from breaking out or whatever. I would like to say in opening to note that the noted, just within the past week or so, the noted futurist Alvin Toffler died. He was kind of one of the first of the modern era to be predictive, and he had really a heck of a career. It seemed like his major concepts of future shock and the wave theory of civilization and the power shift of modern times seemed to have pretty well borne out what he said was going to happen, and it is pretty much as what has happened. In particular, I've always admired his concept of future shock, which seemed quite advanced in the 1960s, and I think as you look at Korea today, it's one of the best examples you can find of future shock, and that concept explains a whole lot of what has gone wrong in this country. Just change faster than the human mind and social arrangements can accommodate, and thus a tremendous amount of stress resulting from that. And I think in all of our deliberations today and our speeches, got to kind of keep that in mind, that as we predict amazing technological breakthroughs in the future, which we're always talking about, and we're hoping that technology is going to solve some of our worst problems before they kill us, as such, but also that when technology and the economy keeps changing so rapidly, we human beings are actually a bit limited in our ability to absorb that and to adjust to it. And there is backlash that happens, and you can see that politically everywhere, from the fundamentalist Islamists in the Middle East to people supporting Trump in America, and all in between, backlash of people who don't like what is changing and it's going too fast and they can't accommodate, and they're losing and they're angry and they're very stressed, and there seems very little way at present to mollify this, since nobody's able to slow down the changes and nobody's able to make us be able to adapt to them in our social arrangements or our personal psychology any faster than we can adapt. Got to keep this in mind. This process is, where does this go and how do we square that circle and be able to handle this, or else nothing is going to work if we don't. Okay, so that is an opening. And we begin with Benjamin J. Butler, who is going to give our first presentation on this. He's going to set the tone.
Right, well, as it says on the screen, my name is Benjamin J. Butler. I established the Emerging Future Institute last year, and we're going to have a proper launch actually in the next 4 weeks. So I'll give you some website details and stuff
Better use
later.
the microphone for recording purposes so that the technology gets it.
Cool. Is that okay? So we're actually going to get on to future shock quite quickly. So I'm glad you mentioned it. But very quickly, my background, just so you have an idea. My background's very much East and West. Born in the United Kingdom in the Royal Berkshire Hospital, same hospital as one of the princesses, but that's where all similarity ends. I studied law, King's College, then I did economics and Japanese at another school in the University of London, SOAS. And then I joined an American investment bank, Morgan Stanley, and worked in London, New York, and mainly Tokyo. Then worked with a Japanese bank, I've worked with a Swiss bank, ran a hedge fund, and then in more recent years, I've been involved in forecasting the future for my whole career, but I've also been involved in observing how information flows around the world. That was my first job actually at Morgan Stanley. But in recent years I've worked and invested in Silicon Valley, and I've also set up an institute at a design school focused on collective intelligence, or how a dialogue, how do we bring minds together to have collective insight? And that's one reason why we wanted to have a circle today. You'll know many universities and indeed in the corporate world, when there's a speaker, normally the speaker's detached from everyone else, and we talk to the students and they take notes. Well, my preferred environment is actually a circle, so I can hear from you as well, and maybe I'll change my mind as well if you say something insightful. And also I'm married to a Korean, and I speak Japanese, so I have different ways of seeing Asia that perhaps some of my fellow countrymen back in England don't. They might not be right, but they're different. So I've coined the current age in which we live the great paradox, because really things on the surface seem to be getting better in some ways. In many ways, there's lots of things going on in the United States and Europe today you could say are better. Lots of breakthroughs, lots of firsts, and in the UK this last 2 weeks, the second Prime Minister of England is a woman, and we've got more women leaders than we've ever had for thousands of years. But things seem to be deteriorating and getting worse as well. So things seem to be getting worse and better, and it's accelerating. So for me, I thought that was a paradox. Now, in traditional Western thinking, we don't like paradoxes, particularly in the intellectual world. The wonderful thing about Asia and Asian philosophy is very much you embrace paradox. The interesting twist also is, as my friend Philip will probably speak about, the most advanced form of cutting-edge science in the Western world and Asia, complexity theory, quantum physics, they embrace paradox, and I think that's important to remember. So for some people, we're entering scary times. I actually think it's very interesting. So as was previously mentioned, Alvin Toffler passed away last month, and he mentioned future shock. future shock is the shattering stress and disorientation that we induce in individuals by subjecting them to too much change in too short a time. It's almost like you stay in the same country, but it's like suddenly, like when I was a British student and I suddenly moved to Japan, everything's different. And that photo actually is a bunch of people that have just been subjected to future shock after Brexit a number of weeks ago. The United Kingdom leaving the European Union, which I was over in Europe studying what was happening. In fact, we forecast that Brexit was probably going to happen, and part of my job is to advise individuals, companies, investors, sovereign wealth funds, and we told our clients that they should take this probability of Brexit very seriously. So, why is complexity rising in the world? Actually, that photo was taken off the front cover of a book called Connectography. And what I've noticed, a lot of the cutting-edge books that I'm reading more and more are talking about complexity theory and bringing it into different subjects. So this guy is bringing complexity into geography. Anyway, without getting sidetracked, why is the world becoming more complex? Basically, there are more connections in the world than ever. That's a geographical or a spatial phenomenon. Many hundreds of years ago, before agricultural and then industrial revolutions, we would live in a village and we wouldn't meet that many people, and once a year we might travel to London or wherever. Now, more and more people are living in cities. More people are traveling. The cost of travel is lower. And of course, explosively at the end of the 1990s, we go into the internet age. So you have more connections. You also have more agents, i.e. people. So there are people living today, old people living today, who have just seen the population of the world go up 4 or 5 billion or whatever it is to the current phenomenal number. So there's more agents, there's more information, there's everything's speeding up. And in complexity, I guess that's a recipe for what is actually transpiring now. So I'm just going to look at aspects of it. So I look at the world holistically. Now, some people confuse holistic or holism with sort of massages and therapy, but I mean holistic in the sense of looking at the whole. My early mentors in finance actually looked at the global economy in a holistic manner. So when I look at the economy or anything, I try and act as the Chinese doctor. So when you look at a person, if they've got a problem with their skin, a traditional doctor back in England might give you some cream for your skin. But if I go to my Chinese doctor or Korean Chinese doctor, I have a good one in Daegu, for example, he doesn't worry about my skin, he's worried about my liver and what I'm eating and my kidney. Yeah? And so I look at the world economy in the same way. And I think economists, they get the economy wrong so consistently. It's very famous that they miss every recession. I say they. There are some excellent economists out there that look at the world holistically, but as a profession, I think we often don't look at the world holistically. I won't go into too many details. So what's going on in the world at the moment? There's quite a few scary things on the economy, society, politics and everything, but very quickly, this is an old chart from last year, but I'm sure it hasn't changed too much. The story for me is the world trade going up, and you'll notice after China joined the WTO has an acceleration. So this is a map of globalization. I was sitting in a bank in 2002 telling my clients to invest in shipping stocks, and everyone thought I was crazy. And in fact, there were no shipping analysts really across the region. There were technology analysts because we'd just come out of the internet bubble, but no one was studying shipping because it was old and boring. But China joined the WTO. And I remember speaking to a fund manager and saying, look, just wait. All the multinational companies are going to move their factories from Mexico to China. And they're like, oh, you're crazy. And then we know how it played out. Multinational companies. I'm trying to paint a very broad picture here. We saw a very large investment by large companies, and China became the factory of the world, and global trade has somewhat flourished. That's slowed down since the financial crisis for many reasons, and I think you can see the break in the trajectory. Now, where we are today seems to be that there's a lot of capacity in the global economy, a lot in China, a lot of factories. However, demand is not keeping up now with supply. So we have a classic situation of excess capacity. If you look back, and China's suffering because it's been left with the excess capacity. If you look back to the Great Depression, it was a different phenomenon. It was I guess the epicenter of demand in the world was Europe, and the biggest producer in the world was America. So America, having excess capacity, suffered a lot in the Great Depression. This time around, it arguably is China. So
I believe it's China that will
excess capacity, yeah. So if you look at around the world, there's lots of signs of deflation. So if you look at prices out of the factory in China, the latest statistic was down, I think down 2.9%. And you'll see manifestations of deflation everywhere, whether it's commodity prices, a lot of economies that depended on China are all suffering, South Africa, Australia. But anyway, I could talk forever about the economy. Financial markets are another manifestation. Now, just to remind you, when I talk about the system, I'm looking at the most holistic level. I'm looking at the human society. So all of us in this room, we are members. We are political actors. We are parents, daughters, sons. We're members of society. We're also consumers. So yes, when we study at university, we divide people up. We divide the world up into bits. But I try and look at the world holistically, and so I'm looking at the world in a kind of a 360-degree dimension. So for me, the human system is showing signs of a system going into a very chaotic phase. A very chaotic, like chaos theory. We're moving into chaos, which could be a great thing. I think it's a good thing. Financial markets are showing lots of signs of chaos. That's a chart of the Baltic Freight Index. It's the price of shipping commodities around Asia. And it's bounced up recently, but it saw a precipitous decline. That's what's been happening in the US Treasury market, bond market. It used to be a very stable market, and it's showing signs of less stability in recent times. Now, some people think that if you look at the world, there's been violent moves in many different assets around the world. Oil prices more than halved. Stocks in certain countries clearly show recession. But many people think the world's okay. Nothing's changing. Because the US stock market has held up. It just it hit record highs. I would argue that in a way, if you think of complexity, that the economic system is like a rotten apple. That certain parts of it you can see, but certain parts are hidden until it's not. And the US stock market is one of the parts that looks okay on the surface. But when you look beneath the surface, you'll see what's keeping up the market is access to a lot of free money. M&A activity, but stock buybacks. So companies, if they were really positive about the world, they would invest in new factories and new equipment and research. But actually, these companies, the multinational companies, have just been buying back their own shares. So their stock price goes up, and the board of directors receive lots of compensation. Now, you could say that's morally wrong. It seems to be legal. I don't know whether I would do the same thing if I was a board director, but clearly they're not particularly positive about the world, but they're receiving reasonable remuneration. So the economy is showing lots of signs of stress. Take Europe. Europe could actually end up being, China and Europe could end up being the trigger points for the next financial crisis. If you look at Europe today, the banking system of certain countries, Italy, is suffering from massive problems. Technology. So some people talk about the fourth industrial revolution. I think it's bigger than that. There's one of the founders of Singularity University in San Francisco said it's like we're living in a time of 10 Gutenberg moments, the printing press. It's that significant. And you'll see all the huge things that are happening and will happen. Next week for my new book, I'm going to interview a CEO of a drone company, for example. But we're going to see huge changes in the next 10 years. In fact, one of the most smartest CEOs in the United States, who's now retired, Chambers of Cisco, he said in front of 100 CEOs of corporate America, he said something like, in 10 years' time, 40 of you won't be here. And I think that could be a conservative estimation. By the way, another sign of chaos is that the lifespan of the company keeps falling. I don't know what it is today, but it's getting shorter and shorter. I don't know whether it used to be 40 years and now we're at 20 years, but anyway, it's significantly shorter than the average span of a human. This is a fascinating chart. If anyone wants it, you can contact me afterwards. But the World Economic Forum in Davos, that hopefully I'll attend next year, they asked 800 influential leaders these questions. And in 10 years, what's going to happen? And 10%, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but 10% of people will be wearing clothes connected to the internet. I actually had a meeting with the CEO of a company in Spain recently, and his company was trying to. They're going to create chips that go in our clothes, and then manufacturers will be able to analyze the data in all sorts of ways. But phenomenal things. Driverless cars appearing everywhere. 3D printing is going to be a huge phenomenon and will have a very large impact on Asia. And these guys at the World Economic Forum calculated the impact on jobs. Huge displacement of jobs people are concerned about. And of course, this will hit East Asia, particularly places like China. Societal stress. Now, this is a global phenomenon as far as I'm concerned. I just picked 2 data points, but if I started off with talking about the economy today, if you look at the distribution of wealth, we're back at record highs. And I think this is fueling a lot of anger towards politicians in many countries around the world. I haven't seen any data of any country where the Gini coefficient's getting better, but if you have, I'd love to know. I've spent time living in Hong Kong. It's one of the worst places in the world at the moment. And I put there, that's manifested in all sorts of ways. Drug addiction is a horrendous epidemic at the moment and might not always appear in the traditional statistics, because in America there's a pandemic of legal pills that people are taking. Civil unrest we're seeing around the world is a sign the system's kind of shaking. I picked this off a blog yesterday, actually. Obama there on the left saying, commenting on Trump's doom and gloom doesn't match reality. But next to it, the front page is of the streets of Munich, where people are running around with guns. And again, I see this phenomenon happening across the world, and if you want to talk about why and everything, I can certainly tell you why we've been expecting it, and it's unfortunately happening at the moment. Geopolitical revolution, maybe we can talk about that later, but things seem to be accelerating on that front. But there's definitely a pushback now. When 9/11 happened, and then the US started to intervene in many countries across the Middle East, the populations went along with their political leaders, but now there's a lot more pushback. Citizens around the world are tired of endless wars. Climate change. A friend of mine writes a blog in the UK, and I think that was a simulation of New York, I think, going underwater. And his comment was, climate change will make ISIS look like amateurs. Which I thought was an interesting comment. My idea is not to talk about just doom and gloom. Asian philosophy is wonderful in that crisis and opportunity come together. So for every crisis point, there could be a revolution. So for climate change, many people would say it's not happening quick enough, but the world actually agreed on a few things in Paris last year. Environmental consciousness is definitely rising, and it's becoming part of the mainstream dialogue. So that's the positive side. East Asia. I'll come back to some big themes, but just quickly, China's short-term problem is clearly the economy. That's just a chart to show that they're going to have a lot of firms currently have been issuing debt just to pay interest. So they've got a financial crisis that's happening at the moment. Japan, is it a resurgent Japan? When I first arrived in Japan, they were talking about the lost decade, and then it's the lost 2 decades, and then certainly Japan geopolitically has moved to the right, and I think it was, Article 9, Kyujo, has been something that Abe has been trying to change, or at least reinterpret. And that's a big theme in Asia at the moment. A little bit of a worrying theme, given the history in Asia has not been resolved yet. Of course, it does concern me when you have politicians moving to the right. But some positive things also happen in Japan. Entrepreneurship, cultural change. Philip's just had a wonderful visit to Japan and has interacted with some really nice people there. The careers, I actually took that off a slide I did last year. I was a keynote speaker at a conference and I had to make some predictions about the world by 2025. And one of my predictions was that North and South Korea might merge within 10 years. Now some of my predictions have happened, so that doesn't mean this one will, but we forecast Trump emerging as a political force, and that's happened. But the thing I'd like to say about Korea, there's a lot to say about Korea. It's always been respected for its technology, but I think you'll see more influential Koreans appear on the world stage. So for me, that photo with Tsai and Ban Ki-moon is a kind of a symbol of that. And I think it could continue, but there's a lot of problems in Korea to deal with as well. All right, I'm probably well over time. So here's some big themes. Dealing with future shock, perhaps I should have written. We've got some big issues with the Industrial Revolution. With technology, we could get a lot of job losses. Also, interestingly, people like Trump and Bernie Sanders in the United States are worried about a lot of the job losses in America in the manufacturing sector. Now, what could happen is with 3D printing, we could see more and more production localized, which means that actually, in many advanced Western nations, they could start producing more physical goods on their own soil. So they'll be importing raw materials and they'll actually have to employ people to operate all this machinery. So, that's an interesting perspective. And we have to think, what's the implication going to be for Asia? Geopolitics in Asia, a lot of fault lines emerging, particularly between the countries that align themselves with the United States, Japan and Korea, and those countries that align themselves with China. That fault line is something that I'm sure many of the professors in this room are looking at very closely, and I follow. Too much reliance on large industry. I'd like to see a lot more entrepreneurship happen in Korea. It started to happen. During the financial crisis, I spent 9 months living in Korea, and I couldn't find any entrepreneurs, like young entrepreneurs, and I couldn't find any sort of Silicon Valley type organizations. Now they're all over Seoul. So that's a great sign, but you probably need to deregulate a little bit, which will make Samsung and big corporations slightly unhappy. We need to encourage creative industries, but that comes back to education. Challenging demographics and the environmental crisis, which obviously is really important for China. So I'm going to hand over to Philip very soon, but my response to much of these problems we're having, rather than giving hundreds and hundreds of policy recommendations, and we could talk about policy, I think a lot of the issues center in the mind and the way we look at the world. And if we start looking at the world in a more holistic way, we can start resolving our problems much quicker. Otherwise, it's going to be like that game Whack-A-Mole, where you hit one, and then another appears, and you hit that, and another appears. Or in Greek mythology, is it the Hydra, where you cut one head off, and then another head grows. If we don't resolve the way we look at the world, we're just going to keep suffering from problems. Philip's going to talk about the revolution. I really think one major revolution in the world that's happening today is a scientific revolution. And because science is so powerful, if that revolution continues, it will affect all the other sciences and social sciences and everything. And I think Asian philosophy does fit into these new sciences. I've written Gaian theory. That's the theory developed by James Lovelock, the NASA scientist. Please look him up. Gaia theory. James Lovelock developed the idea that the world was an intelligent system, interconnected, and it shows amazing resilience. You know, the world, that the luminosity of the sun increased by 30% over a period of time, but global temperatures did not blow out as you would expect, because this intelligent, almost super organism reacted in absolutely amazing ways, and I hope Philip could give a few examples. Anyway, he pushed the envelope on earth sciences. The network age. I was listening to an interview with Reid Hoffman, LinkedIn. The brightest minds in Silicon Valley understand we're in the network age. That's really going to affect everyone in this room, how you build companies, how you look at the world. And it does fit in with the traditional way that Asia looks at the world. Before Steve Jobs died, he said the biggest phenomenon of the next century will be the merger of, look it up, I can't remember exactly, but it's something like the merger of biology and technology, and the biomimicry. I don't think he used the word biomimicry, but that's what he meant. So we need to understand nature more. As it says there's a few billion years of research gone in. And that's a big trend out there. And finally, harnessing the mind. Another futurist that's well known. Intuition becomes increasingly valuable in the new information society precisely because there's so much data. And I found that in my different jobs, but as an example, when I was working in a bank, every few months I'd have a new information source, and I was just flooded by information, and young people today are just flooded by too much information in a way. So how do you discern what's important, what's not important? So it used to be if you had more information, you had an advantage in your career, profession, in whatever. But today that's not necessarily the case. I find my success as a futurist is taking that information and seeing what's important and what's not important. If you go to Silicon Valley or go to London today, everyone is meditating. Yeah. Even in the city of London, they're all meditating. Some of them are secretly doing it because they think it's a bit too new agey. But people realize that their mind is now an asset. So they used to go to the gym at lunchtime. Now they still probably go to the gym, but many of them sneak off to do meditation. I was speaking at the World Knowledge Forum in Korea last year. It was a really big event. We had like 1,000, I think I spoke in front of 1,000 people. And at that event one year, there was an Swiss guy born in Panama, and he did a talk. He was at a famous MBA school, and he did a talk about the power of the mind, and he was talking about meditation. It was one of the most successful talks at the conference. Loads of Korean businessmen ran up to him with their notebooks, trying to get some tips. And I was laughing, and I said to my friend, it's interesting, Korea has been studying the mind for thousands of years. But now that it's becoming more popular in the West, perhaps Koreans will start to look back at their own philosophies and their own, some of their old practices. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a religious phenomenon. It's certainly in the United Kingdom, hospitals and that are encouraging mindfulness. So it can be religious, but for many people it's not a religious phenomenon. And that's really where I'll leave it. No good presentation would be left without the words of Albert Einstein, just to reaffirm my point. But I think imagination has been under-emphasized in our education system, so that's one thing I'd encourage students and teachers alike, that analysis and our left brains are really important, but you heard it from a top world-renowned scientist, imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited to all we know now and understand. Well, thank you. While imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. So my talk was I touched on a lot of points. Hopefully we can, later on we can have a bit of a dialogue. Sorry if I've gone over time. I'll pass on to Philip, who really is a practitioner in the field of holistic science, and it's a word you won't have heard, might not have ever heard of the word holistic science, but I think you're going to hear about it more, but it embraces all the most advanced cutting-edge sciences today. So with that, I'll pass over to Philip. You don't need this, do you?
Do I need this then?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Maybe if we form a circle again, and I don't need the PowerPoint. Do you want to come in a circle? No, I'll leave it. I'll bring this chair around.
That's a good idea.
Oh. So thanks very much to Benjamin and to Emmanuel for inviting me. My name is Philip Frances, and I teach at Schumacher College. And for the last 30 years, I've been trying to understand how do we get into this disconnection of science and knowledge from life. And I originally studied mathematics at Oxford, and I've gone on this journey which has led to holistic science. And when David was talking earlier, he was saying, what is this crazy engine that is taking us ever faster into a world that seems to have no goal? And I want to sort of bring us back to how did we get into this kind of blind faith in a kind of way of thinking and a way of being in the world that seems to have no justification because it's not bringing us into a saner world, but as Benjamin has so graphically illustrated, it's bringing us into an impossibly fragmented world. And for me, the story of where this engine arose, we have to look, we can go back to Newton, Isaac Newton, who lived in the early 1600s. And Newton, apart from being an alchemist, was the first person to really develop in a disciplined and rigorous way, a mathematical way of looking at the universe. And he developed these very simple equations. So, for instance, between force and acceleration, or the constancy of velocity if it's not disturbed. And these equations gave a real insight into a new type of understanding about the world. So it was not an understanding about how the world behaved in an organic way, but it was an understanding that we could have a conceptual insight that we could substitute for the world. And Newton's laws of motion led to the first kind of steam engine and the first kind of mechanical inventions that have become so common today. And if we look at this way of thinking, then it kind of is a circular way of thinking. So the more we kind of try to replace the natural world with our concepts and this linear way of thinking, just like the train is this linear machine that goes along the track, the more we create a world that's completely fabricated in this way, and the more we then get the impression that this linear way of thinking is the way the world works. So it's a kind of circular truism that gets lived out more and more. And the next step I want to get onto in this journey of how science became disconnected from life is to make a big jump to around the 1850s. Because in the 1850s, there was the French Revolution and many revolutions in Europe, and they wanted to topple the establishment, and they wanted to topple the church in Europe, and they wanted to topple the royalty and the government, divine given governance. And all these revolutions happened, but they needed something to replace what they had broken down. And so they chose rational thinking and science as something more reliable than the old dependence on religions and these traditional societal forms that had been passed on for many hundreds of years. And it was around that time of 1850 that man became completely obsessed with his own understanding and intelligence about the world. And Darwin's theory of evolution was 1859, which gave the idea that you didn't need a creation story. You could have a completely rational story about how life came to be. And in 1861, Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism, his theory of light, was which was very much like Newton's, some four very simple equations which paved the way for all the telecommunication revolution, all the mobile phones, X-rays, radios. So much of the world we see around us has its origin at that time. And of course, along with that, there came this idea of monopoly. Because if you have a telegram system, then you need a monopoly in order to run that system. So it kind of also changed the nature of how business and knowledge was done and communicated. So 1850 was then another critical age, and it again seemed to confirm this spiral, that the more we could invest into this linear, machine-like thinking, where we could break the world down into these conceptual parts, like matter and force for Newton, or electricity and magnetism for Maxwell, then the more we could kind of overcome the natural world. And for many, it meant giving it a more enlightened or a more progressive meaning than if we just left nature to do what it was doing before. So there was this increasing kind of cycle that the more we invested in knowledge, the more technological the world became, and the more we believed that the way we were thinking was the way the world worked. So this kind of this cycle continued, but in the 20th century, we started to have a very different type of physics. So first there was relativity, which was able to see that the way the world worked was not really in this mechanical way that Newton had imagined, where you had very simple parts, that acted in simple ways and allowed simple technologies to be built. So relativity, as the name suggests, suggested that reality was in fact relative to each observer. There was no absolute world that we could explain with our understanding. There was more a dynamic world in which we participated. And the same was true with quantum theory in the 1920s, which again said that when we came to the small particle world, that there was actually no machinery, there was no actual thing on which everything else was built. All you could say there was there was these possibilities for something to happen, and that the wholeness was kind of innate to those possibilities. So what you understood was very different from a mechanical world, because in a mechanical world you would expect that when you got to the bottom layer, you would see the elements of a very simple machine. And that was what science had expected, that when you got down to the level of atoms and particles, there would be this very kind of simple mechanism by which these particles built bigger things like molecules, and how the molecules built bigger things like organisms, and organisms built life. But quantum theory was a great shock, because the whole kind of mechanistic paradigm and model kind of broke down at that point. But nevertheless, and I think the 1920s were a huge opportunity to kind of step beyond this mechanistic paradigm and to say that the world is much more subtle, and there's much more in the world than just this analogy of a machine. But instead, the physicists and philosophers at that time were able to devise an interpretation which kind of saved the appearance of things and allowed us to keep with this very mechanistic paradigm as if it was still true, and maybe even that the quantum theory was the foundation to that material paradigm. But of course, what happened with that picture of the atom eventually was the splitting of the atom, and this very kind of this unraveling of destruction, that science was not only about this positive journey to progress, but it actually had within it this destructive potential. And also with genetics. So genetics similarly felt that if we understood the genes that live in each cell, and that so the genes are instructions for the proteins that make the cell, that just like a machine, that if we dug deep enough and got enough data, we would find those very simple kind of machine-like steps by which life organized itself. But again, after 100 years, after 60 years of research into genetics, we now know that when we get to that basic level, there is an infinite complexity. It's like meeting a completely sophisticated language. And far from there being a simple kind of machine-like origin to life, we're completely surprised that it's like meeting a whole new language, a whole new culture. It's like arriving in Korea and meeting a whole new country. And it's not like meeting some primitive machine-like mechanism from which we can argue all of life. So science itself has kind of contradicted the premise with which it set out, that life was simply machine-like, and that our intellect was given to us because of all creation, we could understand that machine-like existence, and that we could make technologies in the image of that machine-like existence, and that we could kind of improve upon what nature had done up to now. So we've discovered by our own scientific efforts the complete contradiction in that initial model of what existence was. So the question that holistic science asks is, how can we then move forward with a new way of looking at the world that is able to renounce this machine-like metaphor, and that the machine is better, and to replace it with something more organic, and something which is able to see existence with totally different eyes. So one person we study a lot at the college is Goethe, Wolfgang von Goethe, who was a poet in Germany, 1749 to 1832. And Goethe argued that that in order to understand nature, we shouldn't be imposing a view from our own concepts and imposing our own theory on nature, as if our machine-like understanding of the world could substitute for the reality of nature. Instead, he urged us to really study nature and look into nature, and to try to realize that what nature was telling us was how to participate in a dynamic world that was always unfolding through its own means. And so Goethe encourages us, for instance, to look at the plant in a kind of dynamic way, and to see how the different stages of the plant, the leaves, the stem, the different organs of the flower, are all kind of steps on a ladder of trying to express a whole being. So instead of feeling that there's this, we can break everything down to these machine-like parts, Goethe's telling us that we need to embrace the whole of the plant, the whole being of the plant, and then we can understand how the different parts of the plant, the different organs of the plant, are the way the plant uses to express that whole being. So instead of going down and reducing into these finite parts, he's saying what we need to do is to look upward to the wholeness of the plant, and then and then to base the existence of the plant on that whole being. So what we are seeing there is a kind of that, having gone into this journey of science, of trying to look at matter and machine-like development as the basis of the universe, that actually where our science is taking us is to see that through quantum theory and genetics, is that we need to kind of re-embrace the wholeness of things. We need to re-embrace the unity and the form, without which there is no coherence, and we end with a world of just fragmentation. And what struck me coming to Asia, where I've been traveling in the last month, is of course that Asia has this huge tradition in understanding the world through wholeness. And that wherever you go, you meet temples, and you meet monks, and you meet this ancient kind of breathing, living understanding about what wholeness is. And so it's really weird to come here, having lived in the West, and where the understanding has come, we've got all the bits, but where is the whole? And studying holistic science, to come to Asia and see, well, Asia's known about the whole for thousands of years. Yeah. And I think there's a real need for the West and its science, and for Asia and its tradition, to to make a new kind of a new connection or a new contract in which the West's journey through fragmentation no longer is the dominant element in that relationship, but that the West can be open to the fact that it's come to this point where it no longer knows how to make coherent this journey into fragmentation, and that all the hidden riches of the East are just waiting to kind of be reapplied into rejoining this story into something that's balanced and coherent. So for me, that's been the amazing revelation of coming to Asia this year, first to India, to Japan, and now Korea, is this tantalizing possibility that for the West to truly wake up, it kind of needs to reconnect or to embrace again that story of the East.
Can I interject?
Yeah.
1 second. A lot of people here are studying or involved in international relations. And you might not think this is directly relevant to that. But just literally 2 days ago, I was reading a book. I mean, everyone here, I assume, knows Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State of the United States and still around, kind of
Wow.
godfather of maybe international diplomacy. I don't know, but I was reading a book by one of his top guys just 2 days ago. Remember the name? It's called The Seventh Sense. His first chapter, he talks about Asian philosophy. And this is a guy who's embraced complexity theory into his geopolitical view of the world. And the first scene is about how he met a Zen master in China and talks about Asian philosophy. So I just want to bring that in there, that what Philip and I are trying to bring in is a way of seeing the world. It's not necessarily knowledge. It's a way of seeing, and it's being embraced at the top levels of leadership around the world. Not enough, but it's starting to appear. Sorry.
No, and I'd really like all your opinion, on how do we create this dialogue. And there's so much wealth of skill and capacity here in the room, and so I'd really like to hear your views on how this kind of bridge can be made.
All right. So I was going to make a few remarks, Emmanuel Pastreich at the Asia Institute, about the East Asian tradition. I think I'd like to maybe take a few minutes. If anybody had any comments on what has been said so far, or wanted to make a statement now, I welcome you, and then I'll say a few words afterwards. So can we have a little bit of a chance for discussion?
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of thought recently about how old traditions, such as those found in East Asia, can be valuable for refreshing our thinking about what has happened. Ever since I was young, and in the 60s, we're looking at Zen and Taoist wisdom as an alternative to a more mechanistic Western, but more of a holistic point of view. And today, things now, and things that I've been talking about a lot with Emmanuel, about Neo-Confucianism and its kind of wisdom of the connections between personal virtue, personal development, and how that affects the family, and then the local community, and then the larger community, and the nation, how these things radiate outwards, as well as seeing the effect from the other side of the cosmos and the seasonal changes and all the cycles of world change, how they affect each nation, and then that affect concentric circles down to communities, local communities, families, and then individuals from the microscale to the macroscale. They did in centuries past do a lot of thinking about this and a lot of developing of understanding of those interlinked questions, which just so often get ignored in political and economic and business planning today. And so I think there is a lot of forgotten wisdom, shall we say, or neglected wisdom that can be drawn upon. And we're not just totally we're not just inventing a new wheel here or reinventing the wheel, but there are wells of tradition to draw upon to just kind of refresh and inform our current thinking. So,
I think
go ahead.
I'm
Next.
kind of activist for helping people make career quicker on free money and kind of free coding school or free hardware school. So my mentees and students is kind of Korean university students, or other students, because they are thinking now too much stress how to get a job. Because in Korea, more than 1 million young people, when they graduate university, but no job, or just a part-time job. So it's kind of dangerous situation for the young people. No job, no money, so continually asking parents for support. No marriage, no job, no working, only for having a hope to work at government job. So many kind of people are competition. So I want to have them learn some new technology. So anyway, they can make something better, or go outside with some good technology skill. For example, in Busan, an area, one of our university students and some members of our laboratory got a job for NASA funding job, kind of OEM manufacturing thing like Mars exploring some devices. So such a thing is very high technological of aerospace science technology. So we met one of meetup of our Daejeon city. It's near of Korea Institute of Aerospace Science. Anyway, I want to let young people know and learn something that not supporting their own major or science or some schooling. So it's kind of my fate or activist of such things. So my point is, our social flow is change a lot, very fast. And governments, they also, they want to have, but they have no pointless. Just a few areas, and the majority of the people just no concept. Just, one of friend in Venezuela, we met together last night, and he said he was a professor for some engineering. Number one university is Venezuela is kind of petroleum science. But no food, no money, no industry because the crisis of oil, like that. So it's kind of so much danger situation.
Yeah.
Also. So
Can I respond to that thing about
Yeah.
youth
Yeah.
unemployment? really a global issue, not just Korea. Like if you look at Europe, across many European countries, 20-30% unemployment rates, 50% youth unemployment rates in some cities. And again, it comes back to crisis and opportunity. It's like we have this difficult situation, but there's something positive happening as well. So we live in an age where it's easier than it's ever been to become an entrepreneur. So what I've observed in Europe is thousands and thousands of students that can't get a job becoming entrepreneurs. Many students don't want to work in a traditional corporate environment. They're actually rejecting our generation and the generation before us. Like, I don't want to work in an office anymore. I want to work in a co-working space so I can have lots of ideas from other people and work in a new kind of networked style environment. So I would just say, yeah, I have a lot of empathy for young people who are scared about trying to find a job, but I would also say we live in a globalized world. 3D printing, there's a revolution happening. They call it the maker revolution. So you can get online now and very easily come up with new designs and start printing them. And maybe the 3D printers aren't good enough yet, but you can send your file to a factory and suddenly your idea can be turned into a manufactured item. Whereas before, if you didn't have the blessing of a large manufacturing company, you couldn't do it. There's a great book called, what is it called, The Makers, written by the former editor of Wired magazine. And he talks about this revolution. Every young person should read it. There's so many revolutions that are happening, but for a very small cost, you can become an entrepreneur, and career is not just career. You as a young person, you can tap into the global market very easily. Join LinkedIn and all these global phenomena.
You were in your presentation, there was a mention of creative industry. What's kind of creative industry, and not here, but kind of customer. What's the meaning?
I guess the question mark was, are we going to encourage those creative industries more and creativity? But actually, we live in a world where it's pointless dividing between normal industry and creative industries. In the past, Samsung would have been an electronics company, and if you worked in fashion, it was a creative industry. That's all gone. We're all in the creative business, and if you're not, you should be, because your job could be replaced by a robot. So we don't have a choice.
I want to say something.
No, Mr. This, yeah.
Sorry. Was somebody-
He's not.
I saw your presentation, and it really is quite a industrial scale direction the world is moving in. I think your question is about jobs, and then there was one item in your presentation which talked about an environmental crisis, and you talk about seeing the world differently. But these all seem like concepts to me until we really make a shift at looking both at urban and the rural together. We were talking earlier about landscapes, which is the work that I do. And across the world, there is a looming food crisis. More and more people are shifting to cities, looking for jobs, and buying their food instead of producing it. And I'm not saying that everybody should start going back to the villages and producing their food. But having been in Asia to the rural institutes, there are more and more people who are being retrained and encouraged to go back to producing food to the land. And those are very creative create jobs. Those are jobs which are really needed. If we want to keep some holistic view of the world where both urban and rural resilience are kept in mind, then that has to happen. How will we deal with an environmental crisis otherwise if we don't look at it differently? We can keep looking at being more holistic in the way we deal with cities, but we are really not looking at how the ticking problem of the rural areas is. And the two go together. That is holistic thinking. How can we encourage the cities to look at the rural? That's something that I'd like to add to the discussion over here. And it doesn't sound attractive to people. What, to go back and become a farmer? That's the kind. But how can we make it attractive? Is there something in the way we work in cities that brings both into one's life? Can we stop being only consumers of food, but also contribute to food production somewhere? That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Good.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Good comments.
Yes, I have, I guess, a question and then maybe some ideas.
Yeah.
I've been struggling because I want to become a student again.
Yeah.
I want to learn China. I want to learn Japan. But this is my story. I've come to the realization that if I don't speak that language very well, there's going to be a limitation to how well I understand that society. So I think it's very, very positive because I see more exchange students coming from Europe to Korea, Korea to Europe to the United States, and I'm hoping that these people will learn the language of the country that they're visiting, and perhaps that will induce a generation, a flood of communication between the West and East, and maybe 10, 30 years from now.
Yeah.
There'll be a broader understanding of different cultures and the treasures that both Asians can find in Europe and America, and vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, I noticed in, in Japan that pictorial way of writing and the pictorial way of language meant there was a totally different kind of mental way of understanding things. That there was much less a sort of continuum of thought, but much more jumping to understandings. So I think that trying to understand the culture, one needs to also understand that language.
I was surprised because a friend of mine, we were talking about the new constitution, to-be constitution in Japan, and if the translation was correct, it was a statement that said family should take care of family. So that was even shocking to Korean.
Yeah.
We don't know why, but I think that's the culture of the Japanese, and it's something that I think the West can really embrace because I see individualism, all across, at least the United States, which I know very well, and the West taking care of the family unit. So I think the strength of Asia, in relative terms, is some values, not scientific values, humanistic values.
Yeah. Because just to say that's something I really appreciate. That in the West, the way we think starts more from our mind, and we try and frame something that includes our heart. But in the East, it seems much more that you begin with the heart and have respect for somebody, and that then something gets worked out, some form emerges from that. And I've really, I've really appreciated having that different type of language, a completely different cultural foundation. as a way of communicating and arriving at understanding in a group. That one isn't trying to come to an idea, but more to hear something that wants to be spoken in the room. And to me, that's why we're here today, is to hear something being spoken. And the diversity of everybody who's here helps create the conditions for something to kind of speak.
One question for Benjamin. I don't know if it's your view or the Institute's view of the Emerging Future Institute, but you mentioned the unification of Korea in your presentation. I'm just curious if you remember at all some of the assumptions or the scenarios that you took into consideration to make that prediction.
Comment on that very quickly, but I know Emmanuel wants to say
No problem, go ahead.
a few things. So that came, my mind, to be quite frank, my focus in the last 3 months has been very much on the UK, Brexit, and on these affairs, and then US presidential race. So I've been a little bit removed from Asia. Normally that's not so much the case. So I was asked to give a keynote speak at a huge conference last year, and they wanted me to think that I was in 2025 and I was telling the story of what happened.
Right.
So I made some kind of wacky forecasts, and then 3 of them happened in 2 weeks after, and I was like, oh wow. Anyway, the Korea one was based on some facts at the time and conversations with ex-diplomats, people that were close to, not in a working relationship in terms of currently working in governments. These were retired diplomats who were able to read the tea leaves, and I was just looking at a lot of movements that seemed to me that the possibility was higher than ever, and there seemed to be, I can't remember all of them, but there seemed to be conversations at the senior level between South Korea and North Korea at venues around the world, and it just seemed to me that there was a movement. Now, if and there's probably people in the room now that are more up to date with what's going on in the last few months, but if I also zoom out, sometimes I'm able to make quite good predictions about specific countries just from my holistic view of what's going on in the whole world. And to me, North-South Korea is one of those kind of things that wants to resolve itself. It's been there too long. Culturally, I know many Koreans are scared of the North Korean government, but they're interested in the people of North Korea. A friend of mine runs an NGO. She's involved in the World Economic Forum, and there was just interesting coincidences. I remember her telling me that she worked in North Korea. I found the people amazing. She's been there for weeks working in an NGO. She's a very influential business person. And then last year she said to me privately, I think unification will go its way. And then she led a delegation of business people into North Korea, and they were all involved in an NGO, but clearly they felt something was going to happen. And maybe you'll know better than me, there are a few high-profile business people that were visiting North Korea last year. So I don't know, my view's not really super up-to-date. There's a little bit of intuition in there, but sometimes Emmanuel said some words at least.
Oh. Maybe I will say a few
Did
words.
you want this?
Oh, you want to give that to me?
Yeah.
Does it matter?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's best.
It's best. That sounds like a powerful statement. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about traditional culture. Regarding the issue of North and South Korea, I've had several people remark to me recently that the Kaesong industrial complex was closed down last year in a rather political move. Many people I think, felt sad that that happened. But when I asked various influential individuals, they said to me that they imagined that the next step was not reopening Kaesong Industrial Complex, but something much more comprehensive as a next step. So there seemed to certainly be a mood, if it's somewhat subdued and not in the front pages, that some sort of quantum step is required. So I was very interested. It's the same theme, although from a slightly different perspective. So my original field was classical literature. I studied classical Chinese literature originally, and then I studied Japanese literature for many, many years and taught it. When I was at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, I started working on technology-related issues, in part because I was interested in technology when I was in high school, in part because the University of Illinois is just very strong in technology and not so strong actually in Asian studies. And so I was sort of inevitably drawn in that way. And then when I came to Korea first in 2007, Asia Institute started in Daejeon. Did a lot of projects with research institutes, Korea Research Institute for Bioscience and Biotechnology. I mean, a variety of 6 or 7 different research institutes. So originally, most of our Asia Institute reports were on technology. Over time, I came to feel, well, first I felt there was this gap. I'd been trained in classical literature, I'd worked on 17th, 18th century, and here I was doing modern Korean society, technology, and to some degree local governance. And it seemed to be quite distant from what I was trained in. And somewhat shockingly, many of the Koreans were not very interested in traditional Korean governance or systems, thought, technology. However, the particular crisis of the moment, ironically related actually to rapid industrial technological evolution, is that a lot of the knowledge in East Asia is becoming increasingly relevant. And it's often linked to the West in ways that many of us are not all that well aware. So in terms of the linkage, I mean, if we look at, say, the French Revolution, well, first the American Revolution, the French Revolution, recent efforts, research have shown that the Asian, or say the Confucian tradition, had a considerable impact on both the American and French Revolution. Although not necessarily, the Declaration of Independence doesn't refer to Confucius explicitly, but in the discussions on politics and on governance in the 18th century, there are many writings in which, of course, many texts were translated to French, German, and English, but Confucianism was put forth as a scientific means of governance as opposed to governance by nobility or inherited wealth or the church. And Confucianism was seen as a system in which people were evaluated through a civil service exam based upon their ability and their skills, and were promoted on the basis of their achievements, right? And so this was a strong counterweight in the discussion on politics, which underlay much of the move to what we think of as more modern democracy, as opposed to ancient democracy, which was, of course, was limited only to people who were from the stout upper classes, right? And of course, originally democracy included slavery. I mean, that was the whole point. Democracy and the southern part of the United States, of course, embraced this idea that democracy was for a select small group, and it would be coupled together with a slavery system that would allow these select few to participate. Now, of course, the Asian model, Confucian model, was the opposite of that. Not to say that everyone was totally equal, but in theory, there was the potential for participation. Another aspect of the tradition which has become increasingly relevant is the idea of a sustainable society. So what was truly remarkable about China, particularly, but Japan, Korea, and China, was the degree to which they were able to support very complex bureaucracies, complex civilizations on essentially a sustainable, organic, farming-based economic system. And that was essentially renewable. And there was a famous scholar, I think it's K.E. No, I'm blanking out. Hill. I'm sorry, I'm not.
Doesn't matter necessarily.
It's important to me.
I mean, the name's not important.
Hill. Oh, anyway, he wrote a book. Hill. He was a professor of agriculture at the University of Minnesota, and he traveled to China, Japan, and Korea in 1909. Did surveys of the three countries, particularly interested in irrigation, fertilization, and farm policy, the practice, technology, and national policy. And his book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, which has now been reissued, I think, Organic Farming of 40 Centuries is the new title, essentially advocates that this sustainable approach to farming is something that the West should adopt, and that the United States and other countries are essentially destroying their topsoil by using this very, very destructive approach to, short-term destructive approach to agriculture. Of course, he was not successful in that respect. Most the United States, if anything, has been trying to export its destructive approach to agriculture to Korea, China, and Japan in a form of revenge. But now we're getting to the limits, and I think we have to think much more seriously about what that traditional approach to agriculture and sustainability. Regarding Mini's comment earlier about agriculture, in fact, in the United States, and there have been people who've written about this, if you wanted to stimulate the economy and create jobs, there's no better effective way to do it than to return to family farming. Because if you took all this land, which is now owned by large corporations, and you broke up into small families, farmlands, it would not only produce food to feed people, which then would make them more independent and make them players in the economy, but it would create whole communities and a sustainable way, essentially, of relying on a form of energy other than petroleum, right, which is sunlight, which is essentially the basis of agriculture. So it has enormous potential, returning to what was really the essence of Asian economic success, which was this sophisticated form of agricultural production and supervision of agricultural production. In terms of trade, of course, Asia was the center for trade, right? The China trade dominated global trade in the 19th century, and in fact, the move in the United States, go west to California, people often talk about it in terms of the gold rush, but in fact was driven more by the China trade and the potential for enormous wealth in the Chinese trade. So often we talk about this rise of East Asia or China, but it's a very myopic view. In fact, China has been, or this region has been the dominant region for economic growth for most of the last 2,000 years. So we only have gone through a sort of a blip from the Taiping Rebellion to the present, in which we sort of had a slight downshift. And finally, it can be related to the issues of imperialism and colonialism, which have been incredibly destructive issues, particularly when the West's So the dark side, it's very significant. We're talking here in 2016. I don't have to tell you what happened 100 years ago. Many people in East Asia had a similar experience, right? They, in the 1890s, in the Meiji, in the Tongzhi, in the case of Japan, in the Kapshin, in the case of Korea, thought that the West offered new technologies and new potentials. And then they had a chance to see from 1915 to 1918 how these supposed advanced countries were able to engage in the most pointless, brutal, and destructive war imaginable. And this led to a total reevaluation of the understanding of Western culture and a new interest in Eastern culture in that period. The May 4th movement is probably the center of that, but we find in Japan and in Korea similar manifestations of that. And I think we're going to see that as well, as you see increasing. You can already see it a little bit on the surface. In the next few years, next 5 years, you're going to see, I think, a considerable reevaluation of what this Western tradition was. I would say, finally, say regarding, say, Great Britain, it's one of the great ironies to me that in the 1870s, this is in Great Britain, but it was also in France and the United States. The Great Britain in the 1870s adopted a complex civil service system, right, in which you would take tests and people would be evaluated based on their ability, and then they would be sent around the world as part of this British Empire. This whole system was stolen, essentially borrowed from the Chinese. It was a whole Chinese system. It was the core of the British Empire, but it was borrowed from the Chinese administrative system. And then at the time in the 1870s when they set up civil service, the papers are explicit. I mean, it's not a secret. I mean, they said this is based upon the Qing dynasty's administrative system. So the process of this global imperial or colonial enterprise was ironically related in some ways to the Chinese system that had existed. But of course, the nature of that sort of imperial system was profoundly transformed. And we are, I think, facing a major crisis in that respect, since we have these very, very large global entities which seem to be almost mindlessly or obsessively trying to expand, to take over everything, and control, set up a global systems. And this, of course, to some degree, of course, global coordination is necessary in the face of things like climate change, but the risks are tremendous. And I certainly hope, I come back to Schumacher, who always advocated for this middle way between a, and what's, I'm trying to remember what the word was, I think it was like obsessive materialism and a inflexible conservatism, right? And that, I think in some ways that's really what we have to look for today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good. All right. Excellent progress. I would like to, as moderator, like to introduce you to somebody who just joined our circle.
They're leaving.
Some people are leaving. Okay. Say their goodbyes. Yes, we just came in, my old friend Jake Aller,
Yes.
who just retired from a long career in the United States State Department.
Right.
He's a diplomat, has been working in international relations for 30 years, and particularly in Asia, stationed in India and Korea and Thailand, major stations, as well as paying his dues in Washington, D.C. at the various desks. So hopefully he's got some good things to say. We've already been talking a bit about possible future unification of Korea and how that would influence the development in East Asia, which I think is a very important subject, and other topics about kind of where is East Asia going, and on that kind of diplomatic international relations level, we haven't really talked about it, but like China rising is this going to be peaceful or not? And can the
Did you get a
disputes
chance
over
to-
territory be solved?
Did you get a chance to speculate about the rise of Trump and Hillary?
Oh, no, not at all.
That was another seminar.
We're talking about grave disasters later.
We had a seminar on Trump, in fact, about 2 months ago.
I did. So at any point when you feel ready to jump in with some opinions of your own, do let us know. But did we have somebody else stacked up wanting to speak? Dr. Singh.
I'm sorry, I'm having very bad throat. Silence is good. Okay. Okay, the most important thing which I attended in this seminar was the spiritual response.
Right.
I was so happy to see that Western thinkers are talking about spiritual response. And for so long they were talking about rational response,
Right.
So,
Right.
Traditionally Asia was spiritual, basically. If you go to India, a lot of time has been spent on spiritual emancipation of man.
Right.
But somehow this Western philosophy, this British philosophy, make us believe, no. This is not the way to go. So whole spiritual conception, whole spiritual way of life was destroyed. And we were made to think rationally. And now rationalism has reached its dead end. So where do you go now? So we are left in a very, very serious deadlock. Just 200 years ago, we was being told, oh no, you are poor because you have too much spiritualism. You are fighting each other because too much spiritualism.
Right.
Now, Western philosophy are coming back to us and they are telling, no. Rationalism has reached that end. It leads too much chaos, too much violence, too much destruction. So where we go now?
Right.
So urgent need is that we have to find a balance between spiritualism and rationalism. So I was looking to what should we do, It will not be easy to go back to spiritualism just like that, Because too much damage has been done and too much curiosity to become rich, to become individually rich, has been introduced into the Asian mind. So my son is talking about going to Harvard, becoming rich. He's not talking about serving parents. He's not serving. He's not serving about serving God. No.
Right.
So self-individualism and progress has been injected into Asian mind. It is extreme, extreme. It has reached extreme end. Now, Western philosophy is coming back, and they are telling you, love your parents, love your society, love. Peace in our world, I really want to introduce the spiritual content. You have to first understand how much damage done by Western philosophy in Western India. Then, after the damage has been properly evaluated, and then you start what should we do now? So it will not really bring Asian man to spiritualism. It will be most difficult thing for next 300, 400 years. It's not easy. So damage has been done. First accept that damage, then talk about spiritual stuff. I don't like this. answer your question, like crisis in Korea, unemployment. Let me tell you what is happening. Okay. Now, problem is that unemployment in Korea and economic crisis in Korea is growing and growing faster. Okay. And this year is saying growth rate maybe 2.5. But somehow Korea has failed to understand that economic growth is not only a function of good economic policy, but good policies. So they don't understand the role of non-economic factors into the economic growth. Right. So they completely ignore education, they completely ignore government policy, they completely ignore foreign immigration policy, they completely ignore climate change. They think by reducing taxes, by giving some incentive to the foreigner to come to Korea, they can boost economic growth. So today what is happening, families in crisis. Immigration, foreign people living in Korea are having a serious difficulty. And government in Korea is having a serious life, The climate has collapsed. In Korea, serious crisis, So how can we think of economic growth? Economic growth will come through innovation. You cannot bring economic growth and just by introducing some taxes, by bringing some good economic policy, by bringing some investment policy and inviting. Korea has done a terrible damage to itself by ignoring the social factor of the economic side. So I'm trying to tell them again and again and again, economic growth is a function of good policy, not only good economic policy. Don't ignore the social factor and education. So if you really want to have now all the traditional goods which Korea was selling to the world has been sold on, like shipping, cars, People are making good car now. They don't want to buy Korean car. Shipping industry is dead. Shipbuilding industry is dead. Why? Because West has land. So if Korea wants to sell again, it has to introduce new products. It has to introduce new services. And new products has to come through innovation. Time of stealing ideas from Japan, from Western ideas gone. Because they don't have any new idea. Everybody is facing crisis. Now if Korea wants to have a growth, it has to come from Korea itself. So innovation of new products, new services is the only option. And innovation never comes until the society itself is happy. So they don't understand the relationship between happy and innovation. Korea society is having a terrible society, So Korea is one of the most terrible countries to live in, Most of Koreans living. So Koreans don't understand how sad Koreans are feeling about Korea. If Korea wants to have an innovation, they have to make the society happy. They have to use the stress, and they have to bring the innovation. Until they bring the innovation into the economy, they were never able to sell new products. But where is the innovation? Where is the new education? Nothing. So, my friend, if you really want economic growth, if you really want new employment, focus on the new economy. New innovation. All then, otherwise you are trying to say, introduce some new technology. This is a shortcut solution. Real solution is bringing happiness, bringing the creativity, and bringing happiness into Korean society. Then but something going. They hire some people from India. They hire some people from Japan. They're trying, okay, create a new product. No, you cannot create a new idea by hiring some specialists from Europe, from India. Innovation has to come from within. So you cannot have such institute and try to come out with a new product. That is a temporary solution of the problem. If a society wants to lead to progress, permanent growth, it has to come out with a permanent solution. Permanent solution will come from within, from Korea itself, not from hard structure, from India or from Japan, But there's Samsung, you have to go to Samsung Institute, they hire top of the top brains, they come out with the new product, come out with the new service, come out with the new idea. But they are lowering the Korean society itself. So they strengthen Korean society, that is a completely ignored.
Okay, well, we had quite a long and far-reaching discussion. Maybe just take a couple minutes for our two presenters to remark, and then we'll close the main part of this discussion. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, so just, I really liked what Dr. Singh said about we're entering a kind of new age in which it's not polarized into East and West, science and theology, rich and poor, but it's this challenge of who are we, and are we just materialists as a global society, or is there something more to life that unites us, and can we bring that unity back in as the kind of fountain and the source of what life means to everybody in the world today. So I've really enjoyed this discussion and having this this kind of challenge that crosses all boundaries and all disciplines and kind of unites us all. So thank you very much.
I think I really feel that we're on a planetary journey.
Right.
And this is kind of a theme that I've been running with in recent years. You know, we have our individual life journeys, and I think change is happening so quickly now, and the world is so globalized and information spreads so much. You can kind of, it's almost palpable that we're on a planetary journey together. One of my influences in life was a mythologist called Joseph Campbell. If you haven't read any of his work, please do read it. Doesn't matter what field you're in. You know, and he talks about the hero's journey. It influenced many people in many different fields. Hollywood script writing is based on his work. Star Wars and all the latest trilogies. But you know, he talks about the quest for self-realization.
Right.
We go through different stages in life. We have a call to action. We sometimes meet a mentor. Then we have to go into dark caves we don't want to go into. He has a famous phrase: the very cave, the cave that you do not want to enter, contains the very treasure that you seek.
Right.
We go into dark forests. We have all these experiences, and then hopefully we have the apotheosis, which is the realization that you're much bigger than what you thought you were.
Right.
And I think what Mr. Singh said has a lot of wisdom, that I think humanity is on the trajectory. It might not look, over the next few months and years, it might not look like it. We're going to go through some very difficult times. But I think we need to find that wholeness as a human being. And lots of our solutions to global crises will come from finding that wholeness. You know, I think if your son does go to Harvard, or if you go to MIT, you'll actually bizarrely find lots of professors now who are going to start talking, or already are talking about Asian philosophies, or homegrown Western philosophy that's becoming more holistic, and everyone's talking about happiness, and okay, maybe we haven't achieved happiness in the East or West, but at least we're talking about it. You go to a seminar in Silicon Valley, they're all talking about meditation and mindfulness and how do we make ourselves happy. And people are starting to make the connection between consciousness, creativity and happiness. And that's something that I've done in my research. And I really agree with you, creativity is an inner state of mind. The only way we can become creative, particularly in East Asian societies, where there's a lot of societal groupthink. Even though people here are very creative, there's a lot of groupthink imposed by society. To be creative, you have to be quite fearless, because I've experienced this in my career, throughout my career. When you're about to say something new, people aren't going to agree with you, and quite often they think you're crazy. So I've had so many times in my life where people have thought I was crazy, you guys probably think I'm crazy. now, but it's normally at that time where I'm about to have a new insight. So I'll just leave with that. So thanks for letting me share with you today.
1 minute closing for.
I'm not ready yet.
Oh, okay.
Other people.
All right. Well,
do that first.
So we have a limited amount of time for today's event. So I want to thank everybody for having attended. It's not the end. You're free to interact individually, but I think we've had a very excellent opportunity to discuss some of the truly critical, if not immediately obvious, challenges in East Asia, and also the tremendous possibilities and potential in the technology, in the economy, and also in the philosophy and traditional values of this region. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this Emerging Future Institute and Asia Institute seminar. Thank you.
Okay, we have just kind of scratched the surface on a lot of the thinking, the crucial issues. I myself am extremely concerned about the global climate change that's happening and what that's going to mean for East Asia with very dense populations. It seems that we're looking at quite a large food crisis coming up unless technology has some way to resolve that. We're losing all the big fish in the ocean. We're not going to have seafood, which is something like half of all the protein humanity eats. And the wheat crops are failing already, and many countries are in trouble with drought, excessive heat and such. Wheat, we live on it. Food is just going to be a major problem, as well as fresh water for 8 billion people to drink and use and such. And as we know, there just isn't much happening as far as global leadership. The great countries of the world aren't doing almost anything about it to either slow down the climate change or to have adaptive technologies of how we're going to survive with what we already know is going to happen with the climate. As well as I'm very worried about the effects of we're developing the technologies so quickly, and the idea that robotics and computers, ever since I've been a boy, step by step coming on and are making more and more kinds of jobs redundant, and those effects are already being felt all over the world as a great social stress of people unemployed, from the young generation to older people who are not being supported by their societies, and middle-aged people losing their jobs. And we're rapidly moving to the guy, I think, where like even robots are going to build skyscrapers in the future, and there just won't be any construction jobs. The robots will be able to do everything computer controlled. And the idea that, well, all the young people, we're just going to train them to be 3D printer designers, entrepreneurs. Yeah, like 5% of our young generation might be able to make it that way, but the great majority are not. We're quickly moving into a world where half of the human beings are basically surplus. They're either stuck in a very subsistence environment or just being told by their societies, we don't need you to do anything. And we just expect these people to die, or is there going to be any kind of system where the fruits of productivity are shared among people that everybody can kind of make a living? Remember, when I was young, and some of you will remember this, in the 60s, into the 70s, we were being told with all these computers and all this robotics and technology that production was going to be so great, and so we just wouldn't have to work much anymore. That everybody would be down to a 3-day week of 6-7 hours a day, and because all the fruits of this productivity would be shared fairly equally. The big bosses would only have to be in their office managing 3 days a week, and everybody do 3 days a week of actual kind of work, and then we're all provided for. And I was lectured in high school that the biggest problem of the future was going to be so much leisure. Everybody had 4 or 5 days a week to just, how are we going to fill up the time when we need to develop hobbies and leisure activities and scholarship and all kinds of things just to keep people like that. And it hasn't worked. That was supposed to be by 2010. The world was supposed to be like that, and it's gone exactly the opposite. Those who do have jobs are working more hours than ever, and there's brutal competition to get the jobs and keep the jobs. And many poor people working 2 or 3 jobs per day as such, just trying to survive. And then a lot of people are being downgraded and they're just struggling to survive because they can't get into the economy, including well-educated people in Korea. So this is all going in a very bad direction. You can see right there, it's because the fruits of the productivity have not been shared at all, and very few people are taking all the profits, and it's not being good. So I'm very worried about where this is going, because I don't see any, Bernie Sanders was talking something about this in American politics, and he lost. And he didn't get into the game. I don't know where we're going to find solutions to this before we get to the point of mass violent revolution. That's going to be a very unpleasant future. If we're running out of food and people cannot get jobs and cannot survive, people are angry about this already, and it's just going to get worse. I'm gloomy.
No.
Please say something to cheer me up.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll continue this conversation on a person-to-person basis. And hope everyone we're going to have another seminar in August on nuclear power at Asia Institute, and we'll have a series of other events as well coming up. Thank you again. Okay. Thank you.